to the second session of today's international seminar. Very good afternoon and a warm welcome to one and all present here. In today's second technical session, we have the infamous Dr. Carr-Harris, lead coordinator, Jai Jagat 2020 and International Gandhian Initiatives for Non-Violence and Peace, IGNIP. I request Dr. Priya Matthew, the principal of St.Joseph's College of Education, to formally introduce our resource person of this session and welcome the gathering. Over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon to all. Welcome back to the second technical session on the topic, Integrating Peace and Non-Violence into Indian Education by Dr. Jill Carr-Harris, Lead Coordinator, International Jai Jagat 2020 and International Gandhian Initiatives for Non-Violence and Peace, India Bar, Canada. Dr. Jill was very much excited to join us on these 2 days, but unfortunately because of her personal issues, she was held up in Spain. But she has joined us through online to present the theme paper. Dr. Jill hails from Toronto, Canada. She first came to India with the United Nations Development Program in 1985. Fascinated by international development, Dr. Jill started to work in Philippines, Nepal, Bangladesh, and India. Dr. Jill founded 2 civil society organizations, South-South Solidarity in 1986 and the Jai Jagat International in 2020. In both these organizations, she emphasized on education, women's issue, and international development. Dr. Jill received her PhD in education in nonviolence education from the University of Toronto, Canada. Instead of taking a position as a research scholar, Dr. Jill focused on training of marginalized communities, especially women, as well as with youth on peace and justice issues. In 2007, Dr. Jill helped to establish the International Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence and Peace in Madurai, Tamil Nadu, and in 2017 supported the establishment of its sister organization, IGINP, Canada. Dr. Jill became the international coordinator of the Jai Jagat campaign that enabled her to build an international network on peace with justice. As one of the founders of the International Gandhian Initiatives of IGINP, she has been able to create a platform for teaching and learning peace with justice. She's very humble and cooperative to collaborate with us through her own organization, IGINP. So our seminar has organized in collaboration with IGINP. On behalf of the management and all gathered here, I extend a warm welcome to you, dear ma'am. Since Dr. Jill could not join in person, Ms. Sudha Srinivasa Reddy, founder member of IGINP and coordinator of child-related issues, food and nutrition security program at Center for Child and the Law of National Law School of Indian University, Bangalore, joined us as a representative from IGINP. A warm welcome to you, dear ma'am. Thank you. Have a nice day. Over to you, ma'am. Dr. Jill.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Is it clear
Yes.
for everybody?
Yes.
Namaskar, Jai Jagat. In this very important conference on higher education and engaging emerging trends, challenges, and innovations, I wanted to speak with you about how do we integrate nonviolence and peace into education today. But before I begin, I want to just thank Priya Matthews, principal of St. Joseph's College, the whole team, members of that team like Sister Carolina, because it is through this collaboration that we can learn together how to make change in the educational system. The collaboration for this program is with IGINP, as Priya Madam has mentioned, and the intention here is really to bring in ideas of peace and nonviolence to students of St. Joseph's and beyond, for you to uh, innovate and create new trends for the future. We're fortunate to have my colleague Sudha Reddy with us. She's a fellow of IGINP, an extraordinary woman in a long life of peacemaking. And I hope you'll have a chance to hear from her in the meeting as well. I also see on the screen Sajita, a colleague of mine from Trivandrum, and I welcome Sajita. So welcome to everybody here. This is a great pleasure. Let me begin. The presentation that I wanted to share with you today is in three parts. The first part is really looking at peace education. What does it involve? Why is it important? The second section was to talk a little bit about the personal, why the personal is important in peace education. And the third third section rather, of my presentation today is on strategies of peace education. So friends, first of all, I want to just apologize for not being with you in person. It's really my loss, and this is such a wonderful occasion. All right, let us begin. You know, there has been almost, I think Gandhi and peace education in India have been conflated. In other words, it's very hard to separate peace studies in India without seeing Gandhi as a central figure in that. And this is grown as a result, of course, of the freedom struggle and Gandhi's incredible. What we see is Gandhian centers around the country have in fact been set up, Gandhian departments at different universities to primarily teach peace, and there are many more of those than peace studies departments. There's two major centers which you probably know about, Gandhigram University in Dindigul, Tamil Nadu, as well as the Gujarat Vidyapeeth in Ahmedabad. These are premier Gandhian institutions. And there are many more resource centers to boot. So you can see we have a wide infrastructure of peace education that has come under the name of Gandhi. Now, in current times, the centrality of Gandhi within the freedom struggle is being reinterpreted. So we increasingly see the freedom struggle as many leaders, and Gandhi is one of many. And I think the concern of peace education in India is how do we keep alive peace education if Gandhi is diminished, because we have built so strongly on him. And one of the very important points that I want to share with you today is that it's really not a distinction in order that we are able to continue to bring peace education to our students, and for students to understand how to manage conflict in today's society. Now, I want to begin, as I mentioned in my first section, distinguishing peace education as a Western study from what I've identified as peace education, largely around Gandhian studies in India. And this is important because the Western approach to peace education has been to see it as entities, external entities, the need, of course, to dialogue. And if I was to give you a quick summation of Western peace studies and education in a few minutes, I would draw your attention to Johan Galtung. I hope all of you will read something of Johan Galtung. He was a Swedish academic, and he was a peace scientist who very quickly during the Cold War period, when the thought of nuclear deterrence was so important, he believed that peace was not just nuclear deterrence between the US and the former USSR, Soviet Union, but rather the real problem for him was between the North and the South. The North being developed countries and the South being developing countries, and believed that there was structural injustice, that somehow the developed countries and the rich within the developed countries were gaining huge access to wealth, whereas developing countries were made up and constituted by large numbers of poor people, and they were not able to be in this development game. And he was very influential in giving us his important strategy called ABC. ABC is a way to look at in any mediation or conflict resolution what people's attitudes are, what their behaviors are, what the contradictions are, in order to sort out a conflict. And this got incorporated into peace education. And there's a whole 40-year history, which I will sum up and say that one of the highlights of the peace education that came from Galtung and many others was what we might call the International Decade for the Culture of Peace. Now, this decade began actually in 2001. It went to 2010. It was a United Nations effort to bring together all the peace educators around the culture of peace, Westerners and Indians and people from other Asian countries, to really try to build a culture of peace. And this made sense as we were coming in to the new millennium. We didn't want to see more war and conflict that we saw in the days of the Cold War standoff. We wanted peace. So this actually United Nations Decade for the Culture of Peace brought together some of the Gandhian ideas. They were through ASEFA and groups that participated in the whole program for the 10 years. And so there's no doubt that this was a first major attempt. But basically, the problem is the gap between the individual and the social, that people could visualize the social, but they were not able to transform their individual habits in order to create a culture of peace. And this came up time and time again over that 10 years, that this disconnect was there. And I think what what we learn from this is that this is where Gandhi and India and nonviolence gains a salience that uh, the culture of peace, as defined by the UN group and its large number of discussions, could not, which is that Gandhi saw, or rather, this tradition within India that was articulated by Gandhi and others was that a psychological viewpoint, starting with the self, starting with peace of oneself and building a peaceful society, but not just distinguishing the self from the society, but finding ways to make the self society and the society self. Now, I don't want to get too philosophical, but I know that you will want to know the foundational idea of why Gandhi in nonviolence and peace is so important. And that is um, that where people could see, like Galtung, that there was external structural violence in the economy, in terms of the inequity between rich and poor, and of course the modern cultural violence that we see, our culture to the earth, our ecological relationship to the earth that has become so disharmonized, so out of kilter, that we are struggling to find ways of mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis. So, whereas the focus of structural violence can be seen externally, the approach that Gandhi and nonviolence was to begin to see, how do we change the self? How do we change the self to change the society? How do we change the society to change the self? This kind of um, beginning with the self to society, but the feedback loop to the self. So this was this idea that Gandhi raised, which he said is nothing new, is only taking from the traditions of Indian mindset, a kind of a holistic view of the cosmology. He was taking this, and this is something that people globally are thirsting for, which is why Buddhism is quite popular in many countries. Thich Nhat Hanh set up his village in France, or there are many Gandhian organizations in Canada or in the Caucasus in Georgia. So you can find many efforts of people moving in this direction, but there's a disconnect, of course, with the way we organize our society and our economy, which is not allowing this Gandhian vision to become very bright and strong in terms of the institutions that we have. So let me say that basically Gandhi had a sense of India being the leader internationally, and many people will argue his thoughts were fundamental to the construction of the United Nations as almost a federal system in which many countries could coexist. That this actually came from a nonviolent perspective. So this is what I wanted to. I'll just conclude and sum up my first section, saying that we have a Western view, We had an Indian view based on Gandhi. Increasingly, there's a need to look at nonviolence as a way to reintegrate our global village and global society so that it is not bifurcated, polarized, and in conflict. But you'll say, well, that's all very fine, but how did you come up with these ideas, Jill? I mean, uh, give us a little bit of context, because most of knowledge, as Gandhi himself wrote, is in his Experiments with Truth, which was his autobiography. Most of our experiences and thoughts come from our particular context. So it's always important to understand that there may be some universal truths, but we always must balance it from the location of where we are in our understanding. No one Gandhi has the full universal understanding. Nobody does. And we're all in the process of co evolving and co learning. So, my story I want to talk about in this second part, primarily because as students, you're in a stage of your life where the personal story is extremely important. And as our sister Priya mentioned, I came with the United Nations Development Program. So after completing my education, I really wanted to do something for what I saw from my Canadian, I'm from Canada, so from my Canadian background, something that would be good globally. And so the first thing I did was I joined the disarmament unit, the peace unit at the United Nations way back in the 80s. But I saw, like Gautam, that the struggle between North and South was a struggle that would not allow global peace. And so I made my way to India as part of a UN program, which was working on actually planting trees, if you can believe it. We were in a forestry project trying to recover wastelands in India. And I came and I was this was in 1985, 86. I was part of this UN program in India, and I was a Canadian. And I thought, this is so important. We need to help poor people. This is a poverty reduction program. What a good place to be, until I found out that this poverty reduction program was actually not really helping the poor. It was actually going back and helping wealthy people or government bureaucrats. And I was shocked, because the very trees that we were planting with small farmer or landless people, and we were giving them the rights over the trees for 5 years. But by the time the trees produced fodder and fuel and all of the benefits needed by those small farmers, their leases had expired and it went back to the landlord. And I think this is a symbolically good example of our international development between North and South, which has been Northern countries posturing to give resources and so called greater equitable structures to countries like India, but in fact have created a greater inequity, because they keep 70% of the goods and services of those development programs in those northern countries. So I began to see this back in the 80s, thinking, oh my God, oh my gosh, excuse me, I thought I was doing something good, but in fact, I'm in a society, in this project is not really working for people's good. So I resigned that day from the United Nations. And I remember writing my family and saying I've resigned from the UN, and they were horrified, because every parent wants to give their child security of of jobs and income, and this looked good for my family. And suddenly I walked away from a job. And I remember at that time a woman who's well known in India for her ecological work, Vandana Shiva, was with me. And she, when I told her that I was leaving the UN and I was going to stay in India and do work with poor communities, she said, "But Jill, everybody spends a lifetime to get into the UN and you're leaving it. Why would you be so foolish?" And I think the answer to that question got, this only occurred to me much later, that was a transformative moment. That was a moment when you have a prick of consciousness, you don't feel comfortable with an injustice, and you do something to stand up to that injustice. And sometimes it can lead you to very adverse personal outcomes. And, you know, I didn't think much of it at the time because I wouldn't have been able to live with myself uh, in that project of UNDP. So I had to do what I felt was right. But, it took me many years later to understand that transformation is fundamental to social change, personal transformation, and finding those moments. I've sketched a moment in my life, but I know many of you have similar transformative moments where you um, have come up against a moral dilemma, and you've had to take a road sometimes which is not the road well taken. That is, you've had to find your way out of an unknown situation. So, in this process of taking this decision, I had five incredible mentors. You know, I had many more, but I recall five, and I wrote about them much later. These are Indian men and women, three women, two men, who completely reshaped my vision of everything. So it's almost as if I had a rebirth in India. I don't want to sound, hyperbolic when I say that, but I had to when I decided to make India my home, I had to reconstitute myself not as a foreigner, but as someone who could live in Indian society. And that didn't mean I gave up my Canadian roots. I think I was able to mesh both these identities, which is, again, I want to say, a very important part of the global situation today, where we have to work at different levels with different entities. And I think many of the non resident Indians have learned that by virtue of living outside of India. But my learning was I'll just say briefly, in three decades. And the first decade I worked on women and environment and these issues. And the second decade was okay.
Please, please.
Okay. Spent the third decade getting a doctoral degree and taking Gandhi and these ideas of nonviolence out to many countries, and helped to build the International Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence and Peace. So, what I wanted to say is that essentially I went back to education in the third decade, understanding that unless we change our attitudes through schooling and education, we can't change the society. Just as we need to begin from the personal in order to change the social. And, uh, you know, um, the importance of education, though, as I will outline in the third section, is not just learning peace, but also acting it. So, in the third decade, also, as a part of the nonviolence and teaching and training, we started this Jai Jagat movement in the 150th anniversary of Gandhi in 2019, where we wanted to march from New Delhi to Geneva, walk for 1 year, all across 10 countries, 10,000 kilometers to Geneva to bring the message that we need not just sustainable development goals and an international development that is more sustainable and equitable, but it has to be peaceful as well. To bring together the four dimensions of poverty eradication, and eradicating discrimination, the climate, mitigating the climate crisis, but also stopping violence and conflict. And it's just so extraordinary that this was before the pandemic and before the present crisis that we see in Ukraine. And we were really trying to bring these ideas rapidly to Geneva, these ideas that we need a more holistic view and we need one that starts from the personal to the social and back to the personal. And unfortunately, our march stopped in Armenia because the pandemic came. And so our 50 people that had been marching, they went back to all their different countries. Fortunately, the people who went back to France finished the march into Geneva in order to vindicate all of us that we would not be stopped by this pandemic. But anyway, that was the Jai Jagat March. And I think, had I not had that experience of an international peace action, it would not be possible for me to say that the transformation which I talked about as a transformation, to leave the UN and to join this nonviolence, it culminated in this march to Geneva. It proved to me that I could put my words together to some extent, however imperfectly, with my actions. So, what have we talked about in this second section? We've talked about transformation. We've talked about how you reflect later on a transformative moment. We've talked about how you've got to bring together, that transformation is often pricked by a moral consciousness to raise your own consciousness, and also that whatever you plan in life, you try to match your words with deeds. So I think this was, a lifelong learning of Gandhi and lots of mistakes, always correcting course. But um, it helped me to understand the value of this nonviolence. So let me take you to the third section on peace education strategies. I think this is really very important for you to go away saying, okay, that's fine, but what does this peace education really mean in terms of education? So I divided into three parts for you. The first part is how we have to emphasize in our education head, hand, and heart. Head, heart, and hand, let us say. the development of a whole person, the personality development requires that. And what I mean by that is that we have, in our zest for bringing literacy and education to all Indians, we have overdeveloped cognitive capacities or cognitive skills. And we put an emphasis on the head, on thinking. And we've not only put an emphasis on the head, we've also put an emphasis on those who use their head most effectively get ahead. Uh, they are the ones that can write the competitive exams the best, they can get ranked the highest, they can manage international testing, and all of this puts not only the student ahead, but the student feels they're bringing their parents and their family to a higher social status. Now, the problem is when you concentrate, when you have head, heart, and hand, and you only concentrate on head, you you don't balance the system. And I think that's precisely what we're finding now in terms of social media. And social media is incredible. We're live streaming this program right now. People can watch it from any corner of the world. I mean, social media has been a boon to mankind, womankind. But unfortunately, with every advancement, there are adverse effects which need to be also taken into consideration. And one of those adverse effects is how children are not being able to emphasize heart and hand as well as cognitive skills. For instance, you know, um, let me take for the the interests of time. Let me just take one example of how art helps the affective domain. We all work emotionally. Emotion is not bad. Often women are said they're too emotional and men are much more scientific. Emotion and affective domain is extremely important, and it's an extremely important area of learning. And that's why we do humanities and the arts in higher education. We encourage children in artistic endeavors, in theater, to stimulate empathy and compassion and, a sense of intuiting the world around us. Um, I think in terms, so that's the heart. The hand, what we do is we stimulate handwork. I mean, um, a child, according to people like Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, no child should go to school before 8 so they can build their motor skills in their hands. And this aligns with the need for discovery with your physical self. Putting children into forest schools is something that is happening. You know, the Montessori method of helping a child to understand tactilely with their hands their environment. This is really important. In fact, there's now some literature coming up in education which says, we have this attention deficiency syndrome where young people are losing their attention, but we also have nature deficiency syndrome where children are not putting their hands into soil. And actually, by putting your hand into soil, it feeds your body with sodium through the pores of your skin. I think this nature deficiency syndrome is a very good way to show that we've cut in our zest for cognitive capacity building. We've cut that very relationship with the environment. Now, of course, we've now put environment back as as a subject into secondary education, but that's again in a cognitive way, in a way of abstraction, and not going to the ground and putting your hand in the soil. There was a Marjorie Sachs was one of the great educators of Gandhi's Nai Talam, called Basic Education. And she always said, you know, you can teach sweeping and cooking on the blackboard, but the best thing is to give, you know, a child a broom to sweep. And in the sweeping, learn how to sweep. And in the cooking, learn how to cook and not just abstract everything. And I think this is something that uh, when we say bring the head, heart, and hand together, we're not just looking at each of those learning modes, we're looking at when you have the combination of those three, it's more than the sum of the individual parts. In other words, there's something that goes on in the human psyche that advances consciousness more when you use those three learning domains. And I think, look, it makes you more versatile in a globalized world. I mean, if you just have got your cognitive skills, you've got a limited amount of things that you can do. If you have head, heart, and hand, you're more versatile. And within this globalized economy, globalized society today, versatility, resilience are attributes which gets you ahead. It's not just marks and ability to process information in a speedily way. So I think this capacity that you know, head, heart, and hand brings you actually takes you out of narrow disciplines, allows you to be cross-disciplinary, not fixed on expertise, not so much in silos, brings you into a more holistic personality frame, which allows you to be a much better person. And when you feel in your consciousness that you've transformed to be a better person, you are a better person, and you make a better society. So I think this is something that is extremely important as the first point of Gandhi's or what we'll say as peace education in the world. Sorry, peace education as a strategy of peace education. I'm just trying to find my note here. Excuse me for a minute. This second uh, thing that is extremely important that I want to raise to you is this notion of learning by doing and project methods. Okay, now learning by doing is effectively a way of acquiring knowledge, just as I said that being in the world with your hands is important, not just your hand, but with your head, heart, and hand, acquiring knowledge from real things, from real experiences, not just book learning. I think we've put a lot of emphasis on book learning, and this is problematic today because again, we need this versatility. I'm just going to put on my glasses here. Yeah, so one of the aspects of this learning by doing is something called correlation. Now, this is a term which is purely Indian. You know, it has come from an Indian tradition. It was given, it was articulated by Vinoba Bhave, who was one of the followers of Mahatma Gandhi. Correlation is this notion that by doing, I am connecting a theory with a practice. So normally what we do is we study a theory and try to apply it to a practice. What learning by doing and correlation is doing is trying to find the practice and bring in the knowledge to that practice. Now, knowledge generation is clearly there is theoretical knowledge which is beyond practice. But if you ground the child in practice, they are more likely to use knowledge in practice and not just theorize. And this is why Gandhi spoke about in his Nai Talam, changing the medium of education from book learning to spinning or to handicraft development. And this was picked up by the Waldorf School and other systems of education, even to some extent the Krishnamurti system of education. So alternative forms of education. Important about it is that it creates a knowledge which gives you a direct link with not only practice but employment. In other words, a lot of our education has given us theoretical skills, but we remain unemployed because there's too few white collar jobs for people. And so we need to broaden our understanding of employment beyond what we have traditionally seen as the industrial society, you know, the production of engineers to run an industrial society. We're in a post-industrial time, and I think that is well reflected in our new educational policy recently out of the central government, which is trying to cope with the fact that now young people have to build their own livelihood. They have to build their own enterprises because there is insufficient jobs in the formal sector. Knowledge by doing gives us a much greater ability to create enterprise, to create livelihood, to create business. And it also doesn't make farming and artisanal activities as low status jobs. They can be very high status jobs if you're getting sufficient income. The problem with farming today is it doesn't yield sufficient income. And that has to do with the fact that people don't think that farming is a good occupation, and therefore they diminish it and want to do white collared work. And farming, which is producing our food and the very sustenance on which we depend and on which we're trying to protect with this current climate crisis, that is so fundamental. So I think what Gandhi offered, or not his form of Nai Talam education, basic education, offered us, was a way of doing education which will actually guarantee our survival in a world that is clearly needing to be more sustainable. So, not only did he give us learning by doing, but a project method. And what I mean by project method is all of learning rather than just being memorizing. Project method allows for application in practice. You know, the community service projects that we do, or some sort of community based activities as part of our curriculum, is a kind of community based project method. And what's important about that also is this notion of group co learning, because I think in any project, you tend to do it with other people. So, what we're doing right now, friends, is we're trying to expand this notion of Gandhi, of Nai Talam, his Nai Talam education, learning by doing, to try to see what needs to change in the economy in order to make learning for doing more relevant to today's economy. In other words, parents want, yeah. So we're looking at a nonviolent economy, and I invite all of you to go to the IGINP site to read a little bit more about how learning by doing is connected to a nonviolent economy. And the third thing that I want to stress today is basically, because time is running out, I understand, is how do you, with this Gandhian thinking, build a vision of harmony uh, in schools and classrooms? So the whole idea the education or the Gandhian methods was to treat everybody uh, in an equal way. Teachers are not teachers, they are mentors. We call them Bai and Ben. We see them in terms of being brothers and sisters, not in terms of teachers. What we see in this dimension of Gandhian education is how young people have to be open to others and see differences as a strength. So, differences of caste, creed, and class. We need to bridge those divides, not to separate ourselves and look at identity in terms of those divides. And this is an extremely important point in today, that unless we, as within education, within higher education, learn conflict resolution and appreciate that the most important thing is to resolve conflict to get to solution. Technology is important, but without consensus, technology is less effective. And that building and mediating differences so as to restrain aggressive behavior and that creates factionalism, that creates violence in our society. So we need to find a way to have unity among diversity, find a way in um, bringing people together to find commonalities, but not lose our unique differences. And this is absolutely um, the essence of what I wanted to share with you today, is that there are many ways of doing conflict resolution, but what India offers in its peace education is non-violent conflict resolution, which enables people after the conflict is resolved not to be divided, but to be together, not to be polarized, but to find common ground, not to set up a frozen conflict or deny conflict, but to manage conflict. And there are so many historical examples in India that must be used by teachers to build this notion of nonviolent conflict resolution, because this is what India can offer peace education in so many countries, and help people around the world. And it seems to me, as India is rising to become a developed country and an important global player, that we need to offer something to that globe, just as others have offered from other countries, an offering that is uniquely Indian. When we say nonviolence in Europe or in North America or in Africa, people say, oh, you mean India? India is known for its nonviolence and nonviolent education. To conclude, I've talked to you today about peace education generally. I've talked to you about a personal journey to understand peace and nonviolence. And I've given you what I understand in my humble understanding of Gandhi, his notion of Naitalam, his notion of basic education, the three components of head, heart, hand, building, learning by doing and project method, and thirdly, building a vision of harmony through unity among diversity. And I hope that this will add to your conference and the discussions of the conference. I look forward to receiving your comments and your interactions on this subject. So I, in my understanding, can stand corrected in case there is in my own journey for a greater truth. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. Jai Jagat to everybody, and blessings to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jill, for your enlightening address. I wanted to know if you're open to any questions. We would like to have some interactions.
Certainly. Oh, certainly. Certainly.
I'd like to ask the audience if there are any questions that would be. Anyone? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jill. There are no questions. I now request Dr. Asha P. Patros, the seminar convener, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, Dr. Jill, and good afternoon, everyone. I deem it a great honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks on this enriching session on nonviolence and peace education in higher education. First and foremost, I sincerely express my gratitude towards our esteemed resource person, Dr. Jill Carr-Harris, Lead Coordinator, International Jai Jagat 2020 and IGINP, who despite her busy schedule has found time to engage in this session with inspirational thoughts and ideas. Thank you, Jill, for embracing the ideas of Gandhiji even more than we Indians do. Thank you very much once again. I cannot fail to acknowledge the contribution of Sister Carolyn, Assistant Professor, PKM College of Education, who was instrumental in this collaboration and acted as a bridge between St. Joseph College of Education and IGINP. Thank you very much, Sister. I also would like to thank Ms. Sudha Srinivasa Reddy, the representative of IGINP. I would like to express my sincere thanks to our management for allowing us to organize this session on non-violence and peace education, which is a highly relevant topic in today's world. At last, I would like to thank all the delegates and participants who were keenly attending the session on non-violence and peace education. Thank you all once again.
Audience, kindly note, refreshments are being served in the first floor and the ground floor. The technical session is now ended. The parallel session and the paper presentation will begin in the respective halls at 3:45 p.m. The schedule of the day is being displayed on the notice board and is also being updated in the WhatsApp groups. There are 4 parallel sessions that is being held, one in this hall. The second session will be held in the school auditorium. The third session in the first floor. The fourth session will also commence in the first floor. I request the volunteers to kindly lead the participants to their respective halls. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jill. Thank you so much.